Good morning, Europe, and thank you for starting your day with us. Our top stories for you this morning. 2 hours in Brussels was not enough to seal the deal. Theresa May will now head back on Saturday for unscheduled talks with EU officials. That text is closed. In an exclusive interview, Ireland's foreign minister tells us there's no room to renegotiate May's Brexit deal.
It's not going to reopen. If you reopen it for one issue, well then there's an avalanche of other asks, I'm sure, that different countries will have.
Serious diplomatic consequences. The UK threatens the United Arab Emirates after a British PhD student is sentenced to life in prison for alleged spying. French President Emmanuel Macron condemns the violence over fuel prices that spread to the overseas territory of Réunion. And an iconic art-covered stretch of the Berlin Wall has been saved from demolition. Welcome to the programme this morning. It's lovely to have you with us on Good Morning Europe. Our top story, there are now just 72 hours to go before European leaders are due to arrive in Brussels to seal a deal on Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Talks between UK Prime Minister Theresa May and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker failed to produce the hoped-for draft declaration yesterday. She's now going back to Brussels on Saturday. Plus, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel says she does not want to attend the summit unless a declaration is agreed in advance. Well, May told reporters that more work needs to be done.
Well, we've had a very good meeting this evening. We've made further progress, and as a result, we've given sufficient direction to our negotiators. I hope for them to be able to resolve the remaining issues, and that work will start immediately. I now plan to return for further meetings, including with President Juncker, on Saturday, to discuss how we can bring to a conclusion this process and bring it to a conclusion in the interests of all our people.
All right, well, let's go straight to London and to Vincent McAviney, who's outside the Prime Minister's residence at number 10 Downing Street. Good morning, Vincent. A busy few days ahead of Theresa May, as ever. What are the stumbling blocks she's facing at the moment?
Good morning, Belle. Well, that meeting last night didn't go how she expected. She thought that they would be signing off the text on the future arrangement, but these issues have cropped up unexpectedly. It seems throughout this process, like with the Northern Irish backstop, the smaller areas that hadn't been discussed that much seem to be causing the biggest problems. And so it is with Spain and the Prime Minister there, Pedro Sanchez, raising the issue of Gibraltar, wanting talks on future shared sovereignty to be included in that text. And he said this row looks intractable. This is an essential point, and if this is not resolved, then unfortunately Spain will not be able to vote in favour of it. Now, Theresa May apparently had a call with him last night, and whilst this might be for a domestic audience, he's trying to play this up for those at home watching to make sure that this issue, which has rattled on for decades, isn't being ignored during this critical time. Theresa May just sees this probably as another headache she needs to get through. And also on the French side, Emmanuel Macron, he is very worried about the UK being given some kind of access to the single market. He thinks that that needs to be stopped and that needs to be clear in the future arrangement. There are also questions still about fishery waters that the French will also need to sort of start going to bat about for the domestic audience. So Theresa May will be hoping that this can all be signed off by Friday, because it would really be a bit of a disaster for her if this summit did not go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Vincent McAviney there giving us the view from London. Well, as ever on this programme, we're heading over to Brussels now to get the view from there with our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Good morning, Darren. Now, we've heard Angela Merkel saying that any declaration has to be agreed before Sunday's summit can go ahead. Is that normal protocol for this sort of a meeting?
It isn't, Belle, normal procedure, but then, of course, this is not a normal EU summit. This has been specially convened to try and sign off on this Brexit deal. And really what Angela Merkel is doing this morning is firing a warning shot, more specifically at rather Spain than Britain, because she's insistent that everything needs to be signed, sealed and delivered if she is going to turn up here on Sunday morning. But be in no doubt, she is on one side of the debate, other countries on the other side, not least of all France. There's a bit of a German-Franco split on this, with Emmanuel Macron potentially wanting some negotiations to take place on Sunday alongside other countries such as the Netherlands and indeed Denmark. I suspect that looks unlikely, not least of all because, of course, the withdrawal agreement, the main bulk of this deal, the 585-page document, is now essentially done. It is a legal text. All this wrangling, the visit by Theresa May, the further visit that we're expecting on Saturday, is in regards to this future political declaration. Now, when it was published last week, it was 7 pages long. We expect it to be over 20 pages by the time we see it at the weekend. And why is it so important? Well, essentially, it is where Theresa May is hoping to gain some ground in these negotiations, ground that she desperately needs to sell back home to her British MPs, who clearly aren't on board with the withdrawal agreement, but she is hoping that she can get something in the future declaration that will win them over.
And Darren, this draft agreement seems to have been on a roller coaster ever since it was announced last week. Just how close are we, do you think, to seeing this deal signed off?
I think we are pretty close in the grand scheme of things, Belle. There's an awful lot of bluster, a little bit of last-minute drama, as we would expect with these things. It doesn't work badly for both sides in these negotiations. But I think Spain will, in the end, on Gibraltar, potentially give some ground. After all, there are elections in Andalusia. Many see this as a domestic ploy. The European Union wants this deal to succeed. I think we will get there. But the big question fundamentally has not changed, which is, yes, we could see this all signed on Sunday, but the key moment will come in the British Parliament. We now have over 80 Conservative MPs, Belle, saying they're going to vote against this. That's on top of all the opposition parties and potentially the DUP as well. The big question for Theresa May is, can she win enough? Did she win enough last night? Will she win enough on Saturday? Will this deal be enough to win those MPs rounds? Because if it isn't, and it is defeated in the House of Commons, where does that leave the Brexit negotiations then?
Oh, still on that roller coaster. Thank you very much, Darren McCaffrey there in Brussels. Well, meanwhile, the Irish Foreign Minister has told Euronews that the EU would welcome back Britain in a heartbeat if it does decide to return to the bloc one day. Shona Murray was speaking to Simon Coveney in Dublin.
Withdrawal treaty text is agreed. It's closed. The British government signed off on it. It's not going to reopen. If you reopen it for one issue, well, then there's an avalanche of other asks, I'm sure, that different countries will have. So no, that text is closed. And let's hope that we can see a positive text now on what the future relationship is likely to look like by the setting of parameters today in that political declaration.
Will the EU welcome the UK back with open arms and possibly extend Article 50?
Theresa May has made it very clear she doesn't want to extend Article 50. So I think we probably need to talk less about the what-ifs here and talk more about what is actually on the table and agreed.
But the EU would welcome the UK back?
Oh, sure, of course we would. You know, I mean, we'd welcome Britain back in a heartbeat, in my view. Nobody wants Britain to leave. Everybody, in fact, you know, so many EU countries look to Britain for direction. The EU without Britain, for me, is a lesser place. And I would certainly, at any point in the future, would love to see Britain rejoining or being part of the European Union. But look, that is, you know, that's talking about the future in a way that doesn't reflect today's reality. Sometimes when I listen to hardline Brexiteers, they simplify Brexit almost into a totally unreal series of choices, where Britain can have it every which way, and where the EU will just have to suck it up. You know, and that kind of simplistic, in some cases macho language, doesn't reflect reality. You know, it is not in Britain's interest to crash out of the European Union with no agreements in a whole series of different areas, when Britain and the EU together over the last 43 or 44 years have been putting hundreds of different mechanisms and agreements in place that can't just be pulled apart overnight.
What would you say to the Remainers and Brexiteers, many of whom are willing to vote against this deal when they get the chance in December? What next if that fails?
I am hopeful that the British Parliament can support this. As the debate develops, as the Prime Minister sells this deal, I think she's very persuasive, and I think she has right on her side in terms of what's in the deal. And I think her arguments have gathered momentum in the last number of days. Let's wait and see how this develops. There's another 3 weeks to go, probably, before the vote takes place in Westminster. And instead of talking about what happens after that vote, should it not pass, I think we should be concentrating for the next 3 weeks on actually talking about what's in the agreement that's taken 2 years to put together, and to try to reassure people that it's not a threat to anybody. Instead, it's a practical series of compromises that allows both sides to move forward together.
That was our correspondent Shona Murray talking to the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney there. Well, while the politicians are battling it out in the corridors of power, their debate is being echoed in conversations up and down the UK. In the latest of a series of reports we've been showing in the run-up to this weekend summit, Damon Embling has been hearing from people in the southern British port of Southampton.
Southampton, on England's southern coast, home to the UK's busiest cruise terminal and one of the largest container ports. There are strong European and international links here.
But this is a city that wants out of the EU. In the 2016 referendum, almost 54% of voters went for Brexit. Why? And what do they now make of Theresa May's deal that's on the table?
Emma Janes runs a dog grooming parlour in Southampton. Being in the EU didn't cut it for her. She voted leave.
Well, it seems all a bit of a joke, doesn't it, at the moment? So I was for it, but I don't really know what it'll do, where it'll end up. But fair play to Theresa May for staying and trying.
Southampton is a diverse city, with some areas having been ranked among the most deprived in England. Millbrook on the list. 82-year-old John McGallan has lived here for more than 6 decades. Like many other Leave voters, he wants immigration to change.
If EU citizens bring in particular skills, yes, we're very happy to see them. If EU citizens come in and undercut our workers here, we're not so happy to see them. And I think that has been something of the problem.
Some are confused with all that's happening now. Theresa May's draft deal, all the politics. Others are losing interest.
With all that's going on with Brexit at the moment, what do you make of it all?
I'm fed up of hearing about it, but I can't say no more because I swear, love.
Obviously, we've got our own problems at home, and as far as I'm concerned, we should deal with ours first before we deal with others.
I don't actually know that much about it, to be honest. I know little bits, and there's a lot of fuss about it, but I don't actually know what it means.
But do people here in Southampton, and other Brexit heartlands for that matter, hate the EU? Or is this a protest vote over quality of life?
There's been an influx in immigration within the city, and that's sort of coincided with the decline in the traditional industries in Southampton, at the sort of the dockyards, etc. Also, Southampton has been hit by the global recession and austerity, and I think this has just led to the dissatisfaction and disillusionment of the current situation.
Southampton wants Brexit, but it's not coming as fast as it hoped, with choppy waters still forecast ahead. Damon Embling, Euronews, Southampton.
Well, still to come on the programme, sentenced to life in an Emirati prison, the nightmare facing a British academic convicted of spying in the UAE. And the anger of the French Yellow Vest protesters reaches the island of Réunion. Stay with us for that. Your top story this morning, not quite signed and sealed. The UK Prime Minister Theresa May is headed to Brussels again on Saturday for more negotiations that were supposed to have wrapped up already. And as time ticks by, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is threatening to boycott if a deal can't be sealed first. Welcome back to us here at Good Morning Europe. Now, a British academic accused of spying in the United Arab Emirates has been sentenced to life in prison in a hearing which lasted under 5 minutes. Alleged by Emirati authorities to have pleaded guilty, Matthew Hedges was visibly shaking as he was handed his life sentence. Hedges' wife, Daniela Tejada, has branded the British Foreign Office handling of the case appalling. Evelyn Laverick has the story.
Shock and disappointment. Those were the emotions felt by the family and friends of Matthew Hedges on his being sentenced to life in an Abu Dhabi jail. The 31-year-old was detained last May after completing some academic research. He'd hoped to be freed, but instead he was convicted of spying. His friends can't believe it.
Terrible for the family and also very scary for us who are colleagues of Matt and are doing our own research as well, because what this episode tells the world is that there is a new and different way of repressing academic research as well as journalists as well as analysts alike.
Hedges works at Durham University and insists he is innocent. He says he was researching security strategy. The university's backing him up. Even before the sentencing, his wife Daniela was at her wit's end.
I have done absolutely everything in my power in order to get Matt back home safely. And he is a British citizen, and the British government owe him that duty. I don't know what they should do or how they should do it, but I do feel that they should have much more arduous efforts towards bringing him back home safely to me.
The UK government has denied Hedges ever spied for them, despite reports that he signed a confession written in Arabic, but which he doesn't understand.
We see absolutely no evidence for any of the charges laid against him. We're very concerned for his welfare. The UAE is supposed to be a friend and ally of Britain's. We've given them repeated assurances about Matthew. And, if we can't resolve this, there are going to be serious diplomatic consequences.
Britain does have strong links with the UAE, both in business and in education, and about 120,000 UK nationals live there. Experts in the UAE judiciary have said the life sentence of 25 years is not final. Hedges can appeal. Evelyn Laverick, Euronews.
Well, let's get some more on that story with Alistair Sanford in the studio. Good morning, Alistair.
Good morning, Belle.
Just weeks ago, it looked like the British Foreign Office had managed to secure a release of Matthew Hedges. Now we're seeing this. I mean, it's a fairly shocking turnaround.
Yes, this has stunned lots of people. As you say, Matthew Hedges had been released on bail in late October. It looked like that was paving the way for a definitive release. And now, of course, he's facing a life sentence. The UAE's Attorney General has issued a statement saying that he pleaded guilty, saying that there was compelling legal evidence that was presented to him, and defending the way the case was carried out, saying that there were thorough judicial investigations and that he was accorded his full rights to a fair and transparent trial. Now, to many outsiders, that looks like utter nonsense. Durham University says the judgment was in the absence of anything resembling due process or a fair trial. As we've heard, yesterday's proceedings lasted 5 minutes. His lawyer wasn't present. His family says that during the first 6 weeks of his detention, he was interrogated without a lawyer and he had no consular access. And that's during the period during which he's said to have signed that confession in Arabic. Durham says there was no evidence that he was doing anything other than carrying out legitimate academic research. We heard there from the British Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and Theresa May says that the government is raising it at the highest level with the authorities, and they will continue to press the case.
What about the political implications of all of this? I mean, the UK and the UAE normally have strong ties.
Well, yes, political and economic implications. Yes, of course, the United Arab Emirates gives the image of being a glossy, modern country. The ties are very close between the UK in particular, but other European countries as well. Thousands of companies do business. British universities are present out there. But observers say that, well, there's something increasingly darker going on behind the scenes and that their stance is increasingly intolerant and repressive. It said there are sensitivities in particular over the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Human Rights Watch says it's not just the UAE, but other countries like Saudi Arabia as well. They've noticed a clampdown that's even more fierce over the last year, with dissent not being tolerated. And they accuse the West of failing in their in failing to stand up to it, saying their diplomatic approach has failed. It seems that in the UAE in particular, we know that several people have been caught up in what seems to be a pretty arbitrary judicial system. There are many victims of injustice where pretty innocuous events suddenly they end up getting thrown in jail, sometimes for months on end. There's an organisation called Detained in Dubai which has documented these cases and says it helps people facing what they say are sometimes unbelievable situations they never imagined possible. Now, some Conservative MPs in the UK are now calling for a change of stance for a much more robust defence of fundamental human rights. The question, of course, is how that will be translated into policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Alistair Samford there. And later on this morning, we'll be speaking to Matthew Hedges' local Member of Parliament, Ben Bradshaw. But before that, we've got plenty more for you on the programme, including French yellow vests are protesting as far away as the island of Réunion. And President Macron is trying to weather that storm. And the axe is falling on Italy's big spending budget. The European Commission is talking about sanctions. Stay with us. Welcome back to the newsroom here at Good Morning Europe. It's lovely to have you with us this morning. Now, the French President Emmanuel Macron has condemned fuel tax protests, which have seen 2 deaths as well as hundreds of people injured. Those behind the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests, have vowed to block more roads as the government pushes on with economic reforms. Inspired by demonstrations in mainland France, protesters on the Indian Ocean island of Réunion have been blocking access to oil depots in further unrest. Brian Carter has the story.
A call to action across France in protest at the rising cost of diesel and petrol is even being answered on the overseas territory of Réunion. An eruption of violence not seen in 30 years on the island has resulted in scores injured or arrested. It sparked the need for a curfew and condemnation from President Emmanuel Macron.
On public order, I say it clearly. I have asked the government to be inflexible because the scenes in La Réunion and elsewhere are unacceptable.
In the rest of France, the protests have been on the wane since Saturday's mass demonstrations. But in Nantes on Wednesday, the roadblocks were back. The yellow vests, so called after the high visibility jackets motorists are required to carry in their cars, once again blocked motorways and roundabouts.
We will keep going 24 hours a day until Mr. Macron tells us, yes, we hear you, because he's forgetting us and he doesn't realize his popularity is dropping. We are now defending the people, we are defending everyone.
The Gilets jaunes protest has even reached France's National Assembly. Member of Parliament Jean Lassalle wore his yellow high-vis jacket in a sign of solidarity but disrupted proceedings. The Yellow Vest movement may have begun as a backlash against government taxes adding to fuel hikes, but it quickly tapped the frustration at a president perceived as squeezing the less well-off while cutting taxes for the rich. A new call for mobilization has been launched to block the French capital this Saturday.
Well, let's get an update from Brian Carter, who is in Paris for us this morning. Good morning, Brian. What impact, if any, are these protests likely to have on Macron's planned economic reforms?
Good morning, Belle. Well, at the moment, the government doesn't seem to be backing down on its reforms, especially now that, as I said in the video you just saw, the movement seems to be phasing down. Yesterday, we only counted 7,000 protesters across France at different locations in France, and that number has been gradually diminishing over the last few days. The government says that despite these protests, they will continue with the reform, especially the reform on fuel that will see another price hike in January. They say that this reform is necessary to fight against climate change and for ecological transition. But clearly the government seems to be on the defensive, probably for the first time since Macron came to power. They said initially they didn't want to discuss. Now they seem to be more open to dialogue. And even though the number of protesters have been gradually diminishing, the anger is clearly still there. You know, initially this movement was against the price of fuel, but it's morphed into much more against the loss of public services, against the cost of living, and it really showed a divide between urban France and rural France, especially rural France, where the car is needed to get to different places, and where public services have been gradually diminishing over the last few days. So clearly the anger is still there, is still being expressed. A majority of the French people support the Yellow Vest movement, and some in France are already comparing it to the Five-Star Movement in Italy.
And Brian, you talked there about the anger still being there. How long are we expecting these protests to continue?
Well, Belle, here on Saturday there will be a big protest. Thousands of people are expected. There have been two different calls on social media. More than 30,000 people said they were going to be there, and more than 200,000 said they were interested. They called for a complete shutdown of the capital. They call on people to come from all over France. So clearly, the success of this demonstration on Saturday will be a measure about this movement, whether this movement is here to stay or whether it was just a brief moment in French political life.
All right, thank you very much. Brian Carter there in Paris for us. Well, we've still got plenty more for you to come on the programme, including we'll be hearing directly from the Saudi foreign minister over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and another huge spat between Donald Trump and the judiciary in the US. Plus, how part of the Berlin Wall has been saved from property developers. Before all of that, though, a no comment. And today it comes from Rome, where a team of 50 academics and computer experts have completed a 22-year-old project to rebuild the ancient city in virtual reality. A reminder of our headlines this morning. 2 hours in Brussels was not enough to seal the deal. Theresa May will now head back on Saturday for unscheduled talks with EU officials. That text is closed. In an exclusive interview, Ireland's foreign minister tells us there's no room to negotiate May's Brexit deal.
It's not going to reopen. If you reopen it for one issue, well then there's an avalanche of other asks, I'm sure, that different countries will have.
Serious diplomatic consequences. The UK threatens the United Arab Emirates after a British PhD student is sentenced to life in prison for alleged spying. And French President Emmanuel Macron condemns the violence over fuel prices that spread to the overseas territory of Réunion. Welcome back to the programme this morning. Now, let's take you over to Saudi Arabia, where the kingdom's foreign minister has spoken out about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Abel Al-Jubeir insisted that the Saudi government had no hand in the journalist's death. Al-Jubeir sat down with CNBC anchor Hadley Gamble, who sent us this report.
Saudi Arabia's foreign minister today speaking out on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He said the Saudi government had no hand in his death and called on U.S. lawmakers to wait until review all the evidence before jumping to conclusions.
We have made it very clear that we're investigating, that those who committed this crime will be brought to justice, and that procedures will be reviewed in order to make sure it doesn't happen again. And this is exactly what we're doing.
Last week, the country's public prosecutor charged 11 individuals in the case, including 5 who are now facing the death penalty. This is a growing number of U.S. lawmakers are calling on the Trump administration to punish Saudi Arabia, including the country's crown prince.
Do you feel victimized by the political process in Washington?
I don't want to say victimized, but I think it's very strange that people render opinions without having access to the evidence, and these opinions were rendered from day one.
Your Excellency, this is a top-down society. Explain to us how the Crown Prince could not know about something like this, because people close to him did.
You have, and people were dismissed that should have known and should have revealed what they knew, or should have prevented this, or should have made sure that the authorizations were very clear and the authorities were very clear. This was an unfortunate accident, and it was a crime, and those who committed it will be brought to justice.
But Saudi Arabia's failure, at least so far, to provide significant evidence has raised questions about the country's leadership.
What is your message to those who would suggest that regime change in Saudi Arabia is the best way forward?
You say that's ridiculous. That's way out of line. The leadership of Saudi Arabia, represented in the King and the Crown Prince, is a red line for every Saudi, man or woman. The country is totally supportive of them.
But with calls for clarity growing globally, the kingdom's ability to rebuild those relationships may prove a much tougher sell. For Euronews, I'm Hadley Gamble in Riyadh.
The European Commission has begun proceedings against Italy over its planned 2019 budget after Rome refused to make changes. Yesterday, the EU began a formal process that could lead to financial sanctions. With the latest, Elena Cavallone reports from Brussels.
The perfect storm has begun for Italy. On Wednesday, the European Commission said that the Italian budget draft is in particularly serious non-compliance with EU fiscal rules and opted for a procedure for excessive debt. Commissioner Moscovici said that there are unresolved doubts about the increasing Italian public debt.
Who will pay the bill for this extra spending? We continue to believe that this budget carries risks for Italy's economy, for its companies, for its savers, and for its taxpayers.
The Italian Vice Prime Minister Matteo Salvini laughed at the Commission decision, and regarding the letter that was sent to the government, he said, "I was also waiting for Santa Claus letter. We will discuss politely, as we always done. We will go ahead." The government defended its plans, saying it would boost the economy despite the economic forecast provided by the Commission indicating lower growth. This commission, which is worried only because it says that this budget draft will not reduce Italian public debt, is the same European Commission that until yesterday forced us to make choices that have increased the Italian debt, this Italian MEP says. Italy believes that a departing European Commission has no political way to go further with disciplinary measures, but the pressure from the other member states is high. The formal opening of the procedure will be voted in January by EU finance ministers. It will be operative from spring 2019. Italy would be required to cut its debt for the next 5 years. If the government fails, sanctions would follow.
The doors for dialogue between Rome and Brussels are not completely closed. This is the reason of the meeting between the Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte and the President of the European Commission Jean-Claude Juncker scheduled for Saturday. This might be the last attempt to solve tensions and avoid a worst-case scenario that nobody wants to face. Elena Cavallone, Euronews, Brussels.
Time now to take a look at some of the other stories we're keeping an eye on here in the newsroom. The number of deaths from the worst wildfire in California has risen to 83. Official figures also say that the number of people unaccounted for is now at 563. The first significant rain has fallen in the US state, helping firefighters, but it's also increased the risk of flash flooding. Police in Kenya say they have not yet identified the attackers who kidnapped a young Italian woman. 23-year-old Silvia Costanza Romano from Milan was working for a charity when armed men seized her from a guest house on the southeast coast of the country. The attackers also shot and wounded a woman and 4 children. And a huge dust storm has swept across Sydney in Australia, blanketing famous landmarks and prompting health warnings from officials. They've told people to stay indoors as much as possible. It was caused by strong winds whipping through outback towns. Well, plenty more still to come on the programme, including the politics of America's highest court. The president tangles with a judge. Stay with us for that. Welcome back. A reminder of our top story this morning, not quite signed and sealed. UK Prime Minister Theresa May is headed to Brussels again on Saturday for more negotiations that were supposed to have wrapped up already. And as time ticks on, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is threatening to boycott if a deal can't be sealed first. Have a listen to what Theresa May had to say yesterday.
Well, we've had a very good meeting this evening. We've made further progress, and as a result, we've given sufficient direction to our negotiators. I hope for them to be able to resolve the remaining issues, and that work will start immediately. I now plan to return for further meetings, including with President Juncker, on Saturday, to discuss how we can bring to a conclusion this process and bring it to a conclusion in the interests of all our people.
Well, that was the British Prime Minister. To talk about the latest Brexit developments a little more, I'm joined now by Philip Blond, who's the founder of Respublica, which is an independent British think tank focused on industry and social reform. Good morning, Mr. Blond. Thank you very much for joining us this morning on the programme. Now, your think tank focuses very much on social inequality. With that in mind, what do you make of the draft agreement that we have on the table now?
Well, I mean, the draft agreement as it stands, in my view, won't pass Parliament, and I don't think anybody serious thinks it will. That isn't to say that the government won't have persuasive power between the hoped-for agreement on Sunday and when the vote might take place. And one of the reasons that the British society is so fragmented is nobody has spoken to the ultimate causes of Brexit, which are rampant economic insecurity, but more importantly, rampant cultural insecurity. And why I think Mrs. May feels such a duty to deliver Brexit is because those who voted for it are in many ways at the losing end of the paradigm. You know, we've been governed by quite extreme forms of liberalism for quite a long time, and it's marginalised huge numbers of people. And in a way, Brexit is the response to that. But what's shocking?
We're now embarked on a timeline, essentially, in which Article 50 has been triggered. There is now a process in place. Are you suggesting that we would try somehow, or that Theresa May would try somehow to exit from the Article 50 process in order to tackle social inequality, the social problems in the UK that you think led to the Brexit vote?
No, I don't think she'll do it for those reasons. I think that.
Would it even be possible?
Well, let me explain what I think is going to happen. I don't think the deal will pass the UK Parliament. What that then means is that she has two options. Either she returns to Europe, but Europe's with a new deal, but Europe's been very clear it won't negotiate on the substance of it, or she goes for no deal, but there's no parliamentary majority for that, or she goes out for a second referendum. And I think the EU 27 would give an extension of Article 50 for that, because people might vote to remain, which is what the EU wants. I think that's the reality of where we are.
What do you make of that idea for a second referendum? I mean, you've talked a lot about a democracy. Those who voted to leave would say potentially that is an undemocratic process to go through a second referendum in order to get, in inverted commas, the right answer.
I'm not a Leninist, so I don't think people have to vote once and that vote lasts for all time. Otherwise, if that was true, we'd only ever have one election and then none other. I mean, I think actually referenda are a very poor way to tackle the underlying issues, because they always become a referendum about something else. But I think given where we are, I don't see that there's any other option. I think that the country is evenly divided. Nobody's offered a credible plan for a way through. So I think that that's the reality. And I think that trying to use democratic arguments to argue against more democratic arguments doesn't really work. One isn't in favour of democracy once.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you very much. Philip Blond from Respublica, an independent British think tank there. And the United States President Donald Trump has hit back at the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after the judge issued a rare rebuke of the president. John Roberts was defending a federal judge who had ruled against the president over his asylum policy. NBC's Pete Williams has the story.
that it has resided in this.
John Roberts is cautious and restrained in his public statements, but a comment from President Trump Tuesday provoked a highly unusual response from the Chief Justice. The president criticized a ruling from a federal judge in San Francisco, part of the Ninth Circuit, that put a hold on the president's plan to crack down on asylum seekers on the southern border.
You go to the Ninth Circuit and it's a disgrace, and I'm going to put in a major complaint because you cannot win if you're us a case in the Ninth Circuit. This was an Obama judge.
It's true that the judge, John Tiger, was appointed by President Obama, but when asked about the comment by the Associated Press, the Chief Justice said, "We do not have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges. What we have is an extraordinary group of dedicated judges doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before them." Roberts added that independent judiciary is something we should all be thankful for. Sorry, President Trump tweeted back, Obama judges have a much different view than the people charged with the safety of our country. Ninth Circuit rulings, he said, make the country unsafe. Pete Williams, NBC News, Washington.
Well, still to come on the program, preserving a piece of history at the Berlin Wall. Stay with us for that.